good afternoon. You really are the Shah Rukh Khan of JLF.
Oh,
Huh?
come on.
Look at that crowd. Look at that response.
Wonderful to be here and to see you all. Thank you.
This is what your
I keep
third...
complaining about JLF clashing with the budget session of Parliament. So I actually had to be not only at the budget yesterday while Mrs. Sitaraman was offering her goodies to the nation, and then I had to comment on it on television, and I had to rush here, and I'm leaving immediately after the session, so if any of you wanted books signed, forgive me, we'll have to wait till some other festival. But having said that, it's wonderful that you're all here. Thank you.
And this is what, your third session today?
Third session today, and that's it.
You've just gone from one session to
I'm
another.
afraid so, yeah, more or less. There was a long signing after the first one, which I must say I'm very grateful for. Nothing more gratifying than, some kid who wasn't born when the great Indian novel first came out, coming and clutching a copy and seeing how much it means to her. And that's really thrilling.
That's
So
what makes it worthwhile.
I do enjoy these signings, but one was all I could fit in today.
Did the other sessions get this kind of crowd?
In the space available, yes, we've had
Yeah.
people standing around. That's the thing about JLF, my gosh. People really do come and they listen and they care. And apparently they also seem to buy a lot of books, so it's turning out to be good for the industry. Actually, in a culture where there's so much worry about our kids reading enough, I'm delighted that JLF has glamorized books and reading so much.
Absolutely. I've been doing JLF for like 6 years, and the biggest sessions, the biggest audiences I have ever seen are the sessions I do with you.
Thank you, Vir. I'm glad to have done whatever little bit I can in the process.
Okay, Shashi, I thought because people ask you to talk about esoteric subjects or to push your books, I'm going to do none of that. I'm going to talk about a subject that I think has drawn everyone here, and that subject is Shashi Tharoor.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want to bore the audience with the précis of his career, but I think it's fair to say that he was an extremely well-known writer, very nearly became Secretary General of the United Nations, was offered many lucrative jobs in the private sector, which he flirted with, but ultimately came back to India to join politics. And unlike most people in his position, with his kind of background, who would be welcomed into the Rajya Sabha and garlanded, he was told to go and fight an election in Kerala. So far correct?
So far correct.
So tell us what that was like.
It was the toughest thing I'd ever done, and I've walked through minefields in Bosnia. So I can tell you, it was just amazing. First of all, I was foolish enough to say yes, because the truth is that I left India for graduate studies in the US when I was 19, and the voting age in India was 21 at the time. And therefore, I'd never even voted in an election, let alone seen one up close. So I had no idea what I was getting in for. They said, would you contest? I said, sure, I'll contest. And it was amazingly, amazingly hard, not to mention that I think there were a lot of people, even in my own party, in my own team, in my constituency, who weren't particularly happy that I'd been given the ticket.
Right.
And so they sent me on some incredible wild goose chases. There were several days. In fact, there wasn't a single day in the 3-week campaign which didn't involve at least 20 hours of campaigning. But there was one day which involved 23. I mean, I literally...
23 hours?
23 hours. I got back to bed at 4 a.m., and I had to be up and out at 5 a.m. for the resumption of the next day. It was as if they were trying to kill me, and maybe they were. but it worked, and I'm proud to say that it was a crash course in the realities of electoral politics. I was facing quite a few challenges in the sense that I had never lived in Kerala. I was of Kerala descent. Both my parents were born in Kerala, but I was in a different part of Kerala. But I was born in London myself, went to school in Bombay, high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi, and as this kind of pan-Indian figure went off to the States, did my graduate studies, my PhD, joined the UN, worked for the UN around the world. I had spent much more than half my life abroad before coming back to India, other than holidays every year to see my parents. And here I was suddenly plunged into the fray of a Lok Sabha election campaign. So you can imagine, to begin with, that I was having to have a very steep learning curve. On top of that, my opponents decided that the easy way to bring me down was to say to the voter, look at this guy. I mean, how can he presume to represent us? He doesn't even speak Malayalam properly, which is true, I didn't. And he is used to spending his life in three-piece suits and air-conditioned offices. How can he know what it's like to actually represent the people of this constituency? Don't vote for him. And in a sense, it was a logical line of attack.
Yeah.
But what I did was I dressed in the local attire, because that was something I'd worn on holidays in Kerala. Because like most Malayali diaspora, my parents took us back to their home villages every year when my sisters and I were growing up. So I knew what it was like. I went back. I campaigned in the hottest month of the year. It was March, April, end of March, early April, right before any of the rain. So it was building up to the hottest times. I did the 18-20 hours. And what I said in my not very fluent Malayalam was I would talk to people for a few minutes and say, look, you can see that I have enough Malayalam to understand your problems and your aspirations. And what is far more important, I have the English and the Hindi to express them in Delhi to my opponents. And that argument was the clincher, I think.
It's a good argument, right?
It worked. It worked. I won with a record majority, and I haven't looked back, thank God.
The story when you came back was that Sonia Gandhi was very keen that you went to parliament, that you became a minister, which is fine, and she probably was. But why didn't she just put you in the Rajya Sabha? Why go and fight an election and learn Malayalam and get involved in the sort of dirty nitty-gritty of politics?
Well, first of all, because we didn't have too many options in the Rajya Sabha. There literally wasn't a vacancy the Congress could have offered me. One briefly opened up when the Gandhian Nirmala Deshpande died. She was sitting in a nominated seat. But at that point, Dr. Manmohan Singh needed an economist for good, sensible reason. Mr. Rangarajan got that seat. So there literally wasn't one. So either it was waited out when things might even be worse, who knows what the next elections would bring, or enter the fray. And I thought, naively again, just as I was naive to accept the thing, I said, look, it'll be fascinating to actually earn the right to represent the people. And how do you earn the right to go out and get their votes? So, and especially having lived abroad as long as I had, I felt I really had to come back and get into the fray, and that's why I did it.
And what were your learnings? Because you won against, I think, some expectations, including those of members of your own party.
Oh yeah,
so what was your learning?
First of all, it was a seat we hadn't won in the two previous elections. So it was a communist-held seat. And I went into it because it was the capital of Kerala. I knew that though I was writing in English, all my books were available in translation. My publisher, Ravi DC, is somewhere around. The books were available. I thought at least in a city like Thiruvananthapuram, there would be enough of a literate constituency that would know what I stood for, what I believed in, would be attracted enough by that. Now, boy, that didn't remain true for very long. But in that election, we had the peculiar circumstance of the election falling in such a way that there was a national holiday, two Kerala religious holidays all happening in the same week as the voting. And any sensible, urban, educated professional, by taking 1 day's leave, would have got a week and 2 weekends off.
Yeah.
And so everyone did precisely that. So all the sort of natural city voters I was counting on the votes of, they disappeared and didn't stay to vote. And I actually had to go out and get the votes of ordinary folk in villages, tribal belt, fishermen's colonies. And that was a fabulous learning, because you really got to talk to people whose problems were real, whose problems were fairly vital, and whose problems required political intervention to give them support.
But people see MPs as having a glamorous job. They get up in Parliament, they speak in Parliament, or more often they disrupt Parliament. But the job actually is not that glamorous, because it means going and meeting people in every village and in every small area, and problems that a municipal commissioner should be solving, or even an MLA, they bring to their MPs, and they expect you to devote all your time to solving that.
Exactly. And what is more, I'm afraid, I've always argued that I think we chose the wrong system. The parliamentary system would have made perfect sense for a tiny, educated country like England.
Yeah.
But in India, where people tend to vote for an individual and not a party, tend to vote for a person and not a set of values or ideologies, and who don't even understand the difference between a parliamentary representative who's going to raise his or her voice on your behalf in the legislature versus somebody who actually has the executive authority and access to the budget to deliver solutions for the pothole in your road or the lack of water in your tap. People don't understand that difference. And so, as Vir said, everyone expects everyone to do so. So if the councillor can't fix your pothole, maybe the MLA can. If the MLA can't, maybe the MP can. But they don't understand that these are people with different responsibilities and different levels of government and different kinds of roles. So you do get an awful lot of that kind of work. There's also, very frankly, a tradition that's grown up in our country well before I got into politics, where the role of the politician is seen by the people who vote for him or her as to milk the state for their personal benefit. So you are the interface between the voter and the state. And so, without exaggerating, when you're seeing the public, I mean, I have meet the public sessions all the time when I'm in my constituency, 90% of the demands that come are not even for development-related matters like potholes or drinking water or anything else like that. There were people saying, look, my son has been posted in Nagaland, can you please get him transferred to my state? Or I've taken a loan from the bank and I can't pay it back, can you get me an extension or get my interest deferred? Or it's somebody saying, my son has applied for a job, can you please speak and get him the job? 90% of the things are like this. And when you've done this, you have no choice. You're supposed to do it. That's the other thing. Many of these things would be considered unethical for a Western political representative to do. In India, it's considered the bread and butter, or the sort of milk and ghee of your job. You're supposed to do this for people. And if you don't, you wouldn't be re-elected. So you do it. But it's fair enough to say that once you've done it for long enough, you begin to realize how unsatisfying it is. Yeah. The kind of satisfaction you get out of solving an unusual personal problem is one thing. But the satisfaction you get out of helping somebody out of turn merely because they happen to be your constituent and voted for you, that is not quite the same level, as you can well imagine.
Exactly. The decision to come back to India, forget for a moment that it involved a Lok Sabha election, but it was, in a sense, surely a gesture of faith in India?
Very much
You
so.
were turning your back on a very successful career in the West, and you were saying, my future is in India, and you were not a very young man when you did that.
51 when I left the UN, and I must say, I had, throughout my UN life, also been a writer, as you know, writing evenings, weekends, on planes, wherever I could. Once I even wrote a page of the great Indian novel with a paper resting against the steering wheel of my car while sitting in a parking lot where I couldn't get parking while my wife was doing the grocery shopping. So I've known what it's like to, but all my writing was about India. And I had sort of argued that the writer's physical address doesn't matter. What matters, frankly, is where his mind is and the words on the page. And so in that sense, I had always been, in my mind, connected to India. I've been scratching this itch about what India was all about, what made it tick, what made it work, what I liked and admired about it, what I didn't like about it. So all of these things, but they were from this great distance of sitting a few thousand miles away in a room in New York and writing, right? Here I would suddenly have a chance to be amongst the trees and not just see the wood. Yeah. And I thought, here's an opportunity. Let me come and do this. And that was one thing that truly appealed to me. Secondly, I did briefly have a money-making stint between leaving the UN and entering Indian politics, where I was offered a very lucrative consultancy, which didn't exclude me from doing other things. So I was also making speeches for a speaker's agency at $50,000 a pop in those days. Half a dozen speeches already earning me more than the UN had paid me at the peak of my career. So
we're paying you nothing for this.
Beg your pardon?
And we're paying you nothing.
No one pays me anything in India because I'm a political representative.
Right, go on.
Ghar ki murgi and all that. Yeah. But anyway, so the truth is that I was getting an awful lot of money in the bank and realizing that it meant nothing to me. I had never grown up being motivated by the financial bottom line. Right from childhood, I had sort of asked myself the question, why are we on this planet? You're born, you're bound to die, so why hang around? What's the point? And the answer I found for myself is the point is, while we're here, try and make a difference. And all my life I tried to make a difference, whether it was in my school, in my college, I was active. I was doing things. At college, I founded the first ever quiz club of any college in India. I was active in theatre. I was elected president of the Students' Union. I was just that kind of guy. I just felt I needed to be plunging in and doing things with people. When I was at the UN, I was the first popularly elected leader of the UNHCR staff, the UN High Commission of Refugees, when they had a worldwide election, and I became president of the Staff Council, the most votes. So I was always somebody who engaged with other people. Partially my father was like that, and I think it was genetic and possibly the inspiration of watching his life, helping other people, trying and doing something. So that was always there. And suddenly being this guy sitting in an office on Park Avenue, raking in the moolah, but not really feeling I was making the slightest difference to anybody's life but my own, that was no longer good enough. And so the moment I was asked, will you contest, I said yes without even thinking, which sank my marriage of the time to a Western woman who, as she put it very bluntly, I had no desire to live in a third world country, quote unquote. And I said, well, sorry, this is my third world country, and this is, the country I want to be in, because at least when I'm there, I feel a sense of relevance I don't feel on the streets of New York. I feel that if there are problems, they're my problems. I care, I matter, that sort of stuff. Years ago, when I published the great Indian novel, I had given an interview where I rather grandiosely, perhaps I didn't mean it to sound grandiose, I had said, India matters to me, and I'd like to matter to India. And here I was actually being given a chance to matter to India. So I said, I better put my money where my mouth is, and I gave up the money, and I gave up the good things, and came, and I must say that it really, really is a choice that, even though there have been many moments in the last 16 years when I might have had reason to regret the choice, at bottom I've never regretted. I've said I've made my decision, I'm going to stick to it, and here I am now, 16 years later.
Did you realize then, I mean, honest answer, we all say that politics is dirty, etc. It's full of backstabbers and hypocrites, etc. But did you actually realize that it was even worse than that?
Yeah, it is all that you say, and arguably possibly worse. But the problem is, in any democracy, the best way to make a difference to the people is through politics. It is politics. I mean, I remember once talking to a group of high school girls who were about to graduate, and they said, sir, we're not interested in politics. And I said, what a pity, because politics is interested in you. I mean, the truth is that the decisions politicians make will affect your life tomorrow. Yeah. It will tell you, I mean, it's political decisions that are deciding what kind of courses a university can offer you, how they'll teach it, what kind of jobs might be available for you, whether you can go abroad or not, and if so, in what circumstances, whether you can carry foreign exchange or not, literally every aspect of your daily life is influenced in one way or the other by decisions made by politicians. Why would you not want to have a say in who the politicians are who are making decisions about your life? And that question, frankly, no one has satisfactorily answered. I say you don't have to be interested in politics to the tune of it becoming something you need to do or you need to be an expert at. But you need to be interested enough to know who is representing you, who is demanding votes in your name, what they stand for, what they are using the authority you have given them to get done, and whether you like it, whether you approve of it, whether you care about it. So people must to that degree care about politics, even if they don't care more. And most people in our country, we are an intensely, Amartya Sen called us the argumentative Indians. One of the things we argue about the most is politics. Yeah. So why don't we actually take more of an interest in this? I don't think politics needs to be as dirty as it is. I don't think it needs to be as full of backstabbers as Vir said, or all the other things. But it is partially because of who's in it, how they got there, and what they feel they need to do to stay there and to rise in it. Yeah. So until we change. I wrote once, many years ago, that as our voters get more educated, and more, first of all, more literate, then more educated, perhaps they will also in turn demand more of their politicians, and the entire quality of our politics will also increase. To some degree, that is happening. I think, Desmond Tutu had said in South Africa, why would you want politicians you're ashamed of rather than ones you're proud to have leading you? And that is a question that applies to every country in the world where people have a say. If we're in a democracy, that means you have the right to decide who leads you, who speaks in your name.
When you got elected to Parliament, I think it's fair to say that you attracted more attention, certainly more media attention than the average MP, because not only did you have this great background, you were also a charismatic figure, an articulate figure. When did you realize that this meant also the flip side was that people would be jealous of you?
Very quickly. in fact, you may remember that I was an early adopter of Twitter, which at that point
I was going to ask you that story. Go on, yeah.
And at that point, the media hadn't yet woken up to Twitter. It did so a little later, but too late for me. So they resented madly that here was this politician. I was already a minister because I was a minister in my first term. Here was this minister who was bypassing the media and going straight to the public. So they went after me with a vengeance. And, you know, frankly, I had had a very soft experience with the press when I was visiting from the UN. I would get all these gushing and sort of soft focus glow articles about me. So I thought I had a great link to the media. I suddenly got bashed every single day. Anything I said became a controversy. And some happily and maliciously whipped up controversies, even when they probably knew that I didn't intend what they were pretending I did. You remember the famous, notorious cattle class?
Yeah, I was going to say,
story.
Many people are young. Remind them of that one.
Well,
it was meant to be a self-deprecating remark, and see what happened.
And not just that, you know, the government had introduced an austerity drive, so a journalist, whom I later realized was a card-carrying BJP journalist, but that's another matter, asked me a question on Twitter, "So, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class?" And I replied, "Yes, I will travel cattle class in solidarity with all our holy cows." So the kind of Stephanian sort of repartee that I'm afraid I was prone to in college, but which actually rested on the assumption of the guy asking the question was using the expression cattle class. It was okay for me to use it because in America, where I had lived for the preceding thing, it had been an expression that was around for decades. And all it meant was to disparage the airlines for herding economy class passengers in like cattle. It was not meant to disparage the passengers themselves. But immediately, of course, this hit the headlines. People said, I am insulting economy class passengers. I am this foreign returned elitist. The dung hit the fan within minutes of my doing this. And I actually hadn't any knowledge of this because I'd got on a plane and traveled off to Africa. And these were the days before, ubiquitous mobile phones and so on. So I was first of all on a plane to Brussels where we had to change aircraft and then fly to Accra and change aircraft and go to Liberia. And it's only when I landed in Liberia 23 hours later and there was a reception for me by the Honorable Consul General that guests started coming up to me and saying, "Do you know what's happening in India?" And I hadn't obviously any clue. So then I found out, and I was obviously deeply chagrined because no such thing had been. I thought maybe some people would be miffed by the reference to holy cows. But I had not realized that cattle class could be twisted. But then I quickly figured out, there's a great line of Shakespeare, 400 years earlier, that said, the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. And that is one lesson you need to know early in politics, which is that it doesn't matter what your intentions were. If people hear or can be persuaded that what they heard was not what you intended, your intentions don't matter. It'll be that becomes the story. And for me, it was a huge lesson because things really got out of control over the next 2-3 days. Some of my own senior party colleagues called for my resignation. Yeah. I was appalled. And I came back to India and I saw the party and said, "What on earth is going on? Why don't you people speak up? You know it's only a joke." And the point is that unfortunately, as one of my very senior leaders said to me, there are no rooms for jokes in Indian politics. So in the end, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh himself who punctured the balloon of this by saying to the press at a reception in Rashtrapati Bhavan, "For God's sake, it was only a joke. Why are you going on about this?" And that deflated the entire story. And subsequently, it was he who told me, "Shashi, you must realize your biggest problem in politics is going to be an awful lot of people are very jealous of you." And that's where the story came from for 3 days. But it wasn't the last of it. It continued. Anything I said. I remember one point I used a typical UN word when I said in Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia is a valuable interlocutor. Now, an interlocutor is who you're talking to. It's classic diplomatic language. Right now, Vir is my interlocutor. I'm his interlocutor. But obviously there was somebody, a particular journalist who had it in for me, who decided that the nation needed to know that what I'd actually said was that that Saudi Arabia was going to be intermediary, and he accused me of standing entire India's foreign policy on its head and making Saudi Arabia an intermediary with Pakistan, which I never said. All I'm saying is we're talking to the Saudis, but the result was that this cast a shadow on the Prime Minister's visit to Saudi Arabia, and I was horrified and mortified. And anyway, one thing after another, I finally ended up quitting after my 1 year. So when Vir asked, did you learn the lessons? I learned it painfully and quickly. But it had an unintended effect, Vir, which is that it made me into a better constituency MP. A lot of people thought that after all of this, I would say politics is not for me, throw it in their face and push off. And the temptation was there because I was getting headhunted from very interesting offers from international positions. But I said I've never been a quitter. And the idea of running away with my tail between my legs, which would also imply an admission that somehow I had failed at this, didn't appeal to me. So instead, I accepted my sort of demotion to ordinary MP status and spent my time toiling in my constituency, dealing with its problems, solving issues that hadn't been solved for decades, all of which I wouldn't have time for in the very hectic life I was leading at the MEA. When, in fact, the month I resigned, I had 29 out of 31 days that month scheduled to travel abroad. Yep. So it would have been impossible for me to be as effective a constituency MP as I became. There was a national highway bypass, so people had come to me during the campaign saying, the government put stones on our road, marker stones, 40 years ago. We can't sell our land, we can't mortgage our land. People say the government will take it over any time. For God's sake, get this program scrapped or get the road built. And I took it on as a challenge, and I got the blessed road built. And that transformed lives for a lot of people. And that kind of thing is ultimately, when you ask, I got elected 4 times, the reason that became possible is because I learned the importance of working visibly for the people in my own constituency. Yeah. And that's why I've won 4 times. I'm not sure that I want to do it again, but those 4 times, I had to earn the victory, and that's something anyone seriously thinking of going into politics here, it is hard work. Vir is right. There's no real glamour. It's 24/7. There is no privacy, by the way, and there is no real sense of absolute freedom. You are what the public thinks of you. You are what the party decides you're worth it to them or not. You are what the voters ultimately decide every 5 years.
One of the things people say about the Congress and why it failed to get its message across was it never really understood social media, while the BJP understood social media and were able to communicate a narrative that suited the BJP. Now, I remember that when you were on Twitter and when people were criticizing you and attacking you, I interviewed S.M. Krishna, God rest his soul, who was your minister at the time. And I asked him about the controversies about Shashi Tharoor and Twitter. And instead of saying, that's just stupid and can't people take a joke, he said, well, he shouldn't be tweeting. And it just struck me as summarizing what was wrong with the Congress and why they lost that battle.
But you know something, it's very interesting. At the very beginning, I still remember one of the Delhi newspapers carried a headline, Tharoor's Twitter following crosses 10,000. Yeah. And a number of senior Congress politicians said, wow, what's this Twitter? Tell us about it. How do we use it? And I can today reveal that one of the people who actually called me and asked me to tell him about this was Dr. Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister.
Really?
So, yeah, he said, politicians would love an audience of 10,000 people. How did you get this 10,000? What is it? I told him, but literally this was 1 or 2 days before the cattle trust controversy. And once the controversy happened, all those who asked me backed away. And they said, no, we don't want to get involved in this. What is this Twitter? But you know what's interesting is you guys in the media then discovered social media yourself. You lashed into it, became a force multiplier for the media too. Yeah. And I'm proud to say that sometime in early 2010, NDTV decided to give me an award for New Age Politician of the Year. And to discuss social media and what brought into it, they had on stage Shah Rukh Khan and Karan Johar, who were just beginning to adopt Twitter. And since you mentioned Shah Rukh Khan, I'll never forget this. I just kicked myself that I never kept a video of this. Shah Rukh Khan began that conversation, whoever was interviewing him, by saying, for me, Shashi Tharoor is God.
Oh, really?
He said that. He meant on Twitter, obviously. I'm sure he'll eat his words now, but it was on tape at that time. NDTV can find it.
Why would he eat his words? You were at one stage, you had the highest number of followers any Indian had on Twitter. This is before the movie stars and cricketers joined. And it was unusual globally. I mean, sorry to name drop, but we were once, if you will remember, having dinner with Rupert Murdoch. And you told him about Twitter and what it meant and how you could get your message across to so many people. And even he had no clue what it meant and was skeptical.
Look, there was a lot of skepticism right around. In fact, I remember somebody saying to me, and it was a fairly senior person, I think I even remember which minister it was, look, anything called Twitter can't be a serious medium for a politician. And I said, but do you think Google and Yahoo sound like serious words? And yet many politicians are using them, right? So people will get used to what Twitter. And I gave an interview, I remember, to Harinder Baveja, I've forgotten which publication she was on in those days, in late 2009 when all these controversies at the peak, and I said, I am convinced that within 10 years every Indian politician will be on Twitter. I didn't need to wait 10 years.
Yeah.
When Narendra Modi became Prime Minister, he made it obligatory for every one of his cabinet to be on Twitter. That was just, 4 years after that interview, or 4.5. By the way, Narendra Modi overtook me in July of 2013.
Oh, you remember the month, yeah?
It was front page headlines all over India. I said, my becoming number one was never mentioned, but his overtaking me did become front page news, July of 2013. And he is now, 100 times more because the BJP, and in fact, I remember somebody in the BJP explaining to me, this became for us the answer because we weren't, in our view, getting a fair shake in mainstream media. So social media became the alternative. And that's precisely the lesson the opposition has learned finally. Where when you're in opposition and the media is very fond of becoming Godi, if you don't mind me saying so, then you need the alternative media. And so the opposition's voices can be heard best on social media and on digital media, on things like, websites that are willing to have the courage because the mainstream media with their buildings and their printing presses and their owners who have other business interests, they're the ones who are most easily cajoled or cudgeled into playing ball.
Yeah. Are you worried about the state of the media in India?
You bet.
Yeah? Explain that.
It's precisely this. I mean, the pressure for conformity that has been exacted by the present government. I mean, I think many of you will realize that one of the things that laid the Congress party and UPA too low in 2011 to 14 was a relentless stream of negative media coverage. But it never occurred to anybody in the UPA government, least of all to a decent human being like Dr. Manmohan Singh, that the answer to this was to unleash the ED or start sending income tax inspectors to the offices of the owners of the papers that were being critical. We just assume that freedom of the press is axiomatic in a democracy, and if the press is lambasting us, we better respond. Many a Congress minister resigned or was asked to resign in response to media coverage. So when you look at the fact that we saw media coverage as a reflection of perceptions of us that needed to be attended to, that's in many ways the way democracy should function. Has anybody ever resigned in this last 11 years in this government? No. Even when there were damning evidence available, made available by the opposition, including in Parliament. And the answer very simply is they didn't do it because they were impervious and because they knew that the BJP knew how to silence the media. And that if there was a clamor for someone to resign, it could be switched off from the mainstream press within hours. And that's exactly what's happened. So we are in a situation where the mainstream media, which ought to be the sort of fourth pillar of our democracy, the great, shall we say, escape valve for society, the mirror of all our problems and concerns about society, the voice of the people, that media has very, very quickly demonstrated that it can be suborned, it can be cajoled and persuaded, it can be cudgeled and browbeaten into submission. And the result, therefore, is that except for a few lonely, courageous voices on the digital space or in the social media space, we now are in a situation where freedom of the press is not honored as much as it was even in the last years of the UPA, and where public voices can be very easily stifled. There was a brief exception with the CAA protests. Many of you will remember November, December, January, February, March 2019, 2020. It was only COVID that ended the protest. The protests just had a momentum of their own. Office workers were going out in lunch breaks and protesting. There were all sorts of grandmothers were sitting in Shaheen Bagh and protesting. You suddenly had this sense that people felt violence was being done to the core idea of what being Indian was all about. And they spoke up. But that was stifled because of COVID and the lockdown. And after that, nothing's come back. So what worries me about media, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, is that unfortunately the last 10, 11 years have been an object lesson in how easy it is, if not to suppress it entirely, certainly to stifle it, restrict it, manage it. And that cannot be good for any democracy.
On the subject of media, because, again, the same thing we said at the beginning, because you speak so well and you're charismatic, anything featuring you gets high ratings. In the old day, we called them TRPs. Now they're number of views in the internet or whatever. The consequence of that has been, while any interview with you, and you give a fair number, gets huge viewership, every time somebody does a story that is negative, they get even more viewership. So you've become like this easy way of getting viewers. Just attack Shashi Tharoor, invent a scandal, and people will watch.
I'm afraid so. I mean, the thing that was hardest to bear was when my late wife passed away. And instead of mourning with me or sharing my grief or leaving me alone, people maliciously decided that this was a great opportunity to invent falsehoods and apply them to me. And the result, Vir, frankly, was not just hell and pain, not just for me, but for family members, for my already then in her 80s mother and all of that. But also my sense of bewilderment that there seemed to be no standards, no yardsticks, nothing you could do. I mean, I actually, finally, after being advised by every law firm, don't waste your time suing anybody for defamation, I finally sued that one egregious anchor who was the most guilty of inventing lie after lie after lie and broadcasting it. And the case still hasn't been heard. He managed to win a stay, and the stay keeps getting extended, and then COVID extended it for a couple more years, and God knows when it's going to come. And I'm frankly wondering whether it's worth it for me now to expend my psychological energy in going after a fellow whose lies clearly didn't work in the end, because not only was the case against me unable to stick, but the judge discharged me completely without even bringing it to trial. It was a discharge case. I mean, that is, there was no case made to warrant the prosecution. But yes, I mean, and I remember early on asking a very senior figure in the media, why this? And he said, look, exactly what you said, Vir. He said that you are extremely good for our TRPs, and somehow the TRPs are even better when we attack you. Sorry. And this is quote unquote.
So when we talked about getting into politics and how dirty it was, I was going to come to this. You're in a situation where you suffer a tragedy, and as you said, not only are you not allowed to mourn the person you loved, it's even suggested that you may have had some hand in her death. I mean, that's possibly the worst thing you can do to a person, particularly when there was no evidence, as you said. The case was thrown out, not even heard. And yet the stories went on night after night after night. How did that feel?
Well, you can imagine how it felt, Vir. I'd rather not relive that moment, but yeah, it was pretty awful. We're all human beings, after all. I mean, the only thing I could do was to Kofi Annan, my old boss at the UN, once told me something when he was unfairly attacked over the so-called oil for food scandal. And he really took it extremely badly. And he's somebody who doesn't really visibly react adversely to either pressure or pleasure. And he told me, my father taught me an old Ghanaian proverb, when the sharks bite you, do not bleed. And I said, but how's that possible? The sharks bite you, of course you'll bleed. He said, Shashi, I'm afraid one day you will understand what that means. And it was with this that I finally understood what it means. The sharks bite you to have the satisfaction of watching you bleed, of watching you suffer. And if you don't give them that satisfaction, you score your moral victory. So I didn't suffer publicly. I wrote, I spoke, I did columns, I wrote books. I think probably what has now become my most famous speech, the one in Oxford, was delivered while all this was raging around me in India, on British colonialism. My most successful books were written during this time, and I kept winning elections because my voters didn't believe this nonsense. So beyond the point, the potency of the attacks lost their sting.
Yeah.
But the truth is that nonetheless, it's not easy, and I don't wish it on anyone.
You know, you said at the beginning that people say we're not interested in politics, which is fine, but ultimately politics is interested in you because your life depends on politicians who get into it. Now, one of the things that we've always said is a problem with Indian politics is that people like us, people like you, educated with an international outlook, progressive, don't get into politics. But when they do, as you've seen, they're actually bitten to bits by other people like us. Isn't that ironic?
It's perhaps part of the national character, Vir, what can I say? We seem to specialize sometimes in pulling people down and relishing it. I mean, Schadenfreude is a German word, which means taking great pleasure at the misfortunes of others. But the truth is that it's somehow there should have been an Indian word for it because it's a very common habit in our country. But anyway, I'm not sure that politics is the only field. I suspect in probably every profession. I don't know what your media world is like.
Not as bad.
Sure,
not as bad.
Not that bad.
No.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. But what the heck? I mean, I at this point, what you do is you just say, you'll do the best you can. And when I'm often advising kids about, being the best version of themselves they can be, ultimately it's about knowing yourself and doing the best you can. I mean, the Gita is actually an incredibly useful guide that way. Do the right thing, do the thing right, and don't worry about the consequences or the reward, as long as you know in your heart that what you're doing is right and sincere and honest. Do the best you can. And that's been my guiding principle throughout life, Vir, as well. And so I took all this in stride simply because I knew that my conscience was clear.
Yeah.
I knew that people could accuse me of things, but that I hadn't done them. So why was I going to allow them to define me in my own eyes? I wasn't going to do that.
A final question. I'm looking at this audience. We did a session here, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago, when we did it inside, and there clearly wasn't enough room. There were people spilling out outside because people come to hear you. I'm continually told, and I was told before that session, that the secular consensus is dead. Liberals have lost the argument. Just talk to any young person. They believe in Hindutva. They believe in a more authoritarian form of government. And yet there you were at that session talking about secularism, talking about liberalism, having a largely young audience cheering. You have this audience here today listening to you to talk about it. So explain this paradox. Is India really becoming this less liberal, less secular country?
No, I mean, the truth is that the toxin of bigotry has been successfully injected into the veins of our society, particularly across North India. It's very much less true in the South.
Yeah.
But the fact is that in our country, nothing very easily captures a majority. I often do point out that the BJP has won its power in the first election with 31%, second election with 37%, third election with 36%, which means they haven't even persuaded a majority of Hindus that they're right, because there are 80% of us are Hindu, and so 41% at least would show they have a majority of Hindus. They haven't got that. So there are enough people who disagree with them. But in our country, the numbers are so vast that all of these people, frankly, could all vote for me and I could still lose my deposits. That's our country. I will say, though, that I think there's something about the basic nature of India that gives me a great deal of hope and confidence that we will overcome even the periods of intolerance and bigotry that periodically raise their head. This morning there was a very interesting session on Hinduism. We had Frances Miralles had written a book on Hinduism. I'd written a foreword to it. I've written a book on Hinduism, or two. And one of the things that I argued was from within the faith, that I actually am somebody who can proudly say I'm a Hindu, but my understanding of Hinduism, anchored in extensive reading of the classic Hindu texts, but at the same time selecting what I wish to adhere to as Hinduism permits me to, does not or is not compatible with this other view of Hinduism as Hindutva, as, the hooliganism of the British football fan that says, if you support our team, you're with us, and if you don't support our team, we're going to hit you on the head. I mean, that is not Hinduism, but that's what some people have reduced Hinduism to. in our politics. And therefore, I think it's possible to argue against that not only from a secular, liberal perspective, but also from a believer's perspective. And that's what I've been trying to do. That you can be absolutely a convinced Hindu and say that this is actually a disservice to my faith. And I have said to many members of the Sangh Parivar that tying a Muslim to a tree and flogging him to death until he says Jai Shri Ram is not Hindu Dharma, is not my Hindu Dharma. And they can't tell me it's theirs. So let us stand up. Let us stand up for the best things about our faith and continue opposing the things that surely, whether you're secular or a believer, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you can acknowledge as a human being are wrong. And that's frankly what I've taken on as a bit of a mission. I'm not going to be around in politics forever, and I certainly believe in making way for younger people to have a crack at these things. And I certainly hope that more and more educated, bright, young people will come and contribute to our political space. But nonetheless, as long as I have a voice, and I've said this before, Vir, but I'll ask you to indulge me in saying it again. I know I'm already an ex-minister. I realize one day I'll be an ex-MP. But I'm never going to be an ex-writer, which is why I keep coming to JLF. And I'm going to continue writing and I'm going to continue speaking because all of us as citizens of India are entitled to have a stake in the India that matters to us. And if we have a vision, I think the only argument for politics is to have a vision of a better country, a better society, and to work for it, to speak for it, to stand up for it in the policy space. And what you then do is you just go out and do the best you can to persuade enough of the voters that your vision is better than the other person's vision. And until that happens, I'll be there raising my voice. And as far as I'm concerned, we can be a better India, we can be a better society, and we can be an India that every one of us will be proud of. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Shashi. Thank you. That was so well put. We're at the end of our time, and I think they're going to come and give you a present. Before that, can I call Papa CJ, our official photographer, to take a picture of this amazing audience, because nobody's going to believe me when I say how many people came to hear Shashi.